Welcome to the CRO Talks podcast, the companion podcast for the CRO Roundtable, a bite-sized chunk of content summarizing some recent roundtable discussion topics. All right, today, we are going to get into problem-solving techniques. Now, this is something that every CRO person faces, or rather is inherent to your process, right? You're doing CRO because you have some sort of problem that you're trying to address or solve, right? The problem is always the good root of developing a hypothesis, like the why of what you're doing itself. And there's several different mental models or ways of thinking about how to solve problems. It's not just one specific route that you can take every time.
Yeah. So basically, if I can take a step back and kind of when I was one of the best books
physically or metaphorically?
Yeah, physically and metaphorically.
Okay, you're going to take a step back from the camera for dramatic effect.
For dramatic effect,
and then
away from the mic as well for dramatic effect. So, one of the best books on storytelling is Dramatica, Theory of Story. And what it poses is like the theory that the story, that a story is analogous to a mind trying to solve a problem. And one of the things that they kind of they cover in that Dramatica theory is specific 4 different types of problem-solving methods that a character could take. And so these are your characters will either be one type of problem solvers or another type of problem solvers, etc. So they kind of lay out 4 different types of problem solving in terms of reasoning. How do these characters reason? And these are deductive, inductive, abductive, and reductive. So what I thought would be a good idea is to go through each one of those, describe them, and maybe talk about their use in experimentation, because each one of those mindsets and way of reasoning is important to, one, understand, the other people that you're working with, and 2, understand what type of mindset you might want to apply to a specific problem in order to solve it.
And even though this applies to storytelling, right, it's still applicable to CRO, because if you think about it, like experimentation is a storytelling process. That's why the software Full Story is called Full Story, right? You're getting the full, like the data is telling you the story of what is happening. And so these thought processes are very applicable.
Yes.
In fact, a really specific concrete application of these is understanding these thought processes will help you actually write better, more well-constructed hypotheses themselves for when you're conducting your own experiments.
Yeah, and not only that, but really help you define how do I go about solving a particular problem. So say you've got a specific problem, like, users are not engaging with a particular aspect of the page or whatever, or part of the product or something like that. Then how do you, based on the information that you do have, how do you actually go about solving that problem? And when you can't solve that problem, what are different ways to approach the problem, which is that mindset. So if you're not able to solve a specific problem, how can you approach it in different ways in order to solve that problem? So I think that's another reason why it's really useful.
Yeah. All right. So first up is deductive reasoning. And the definition of deductive is that it starts with a general principle or rule and applies it to specific situations to derive conclusions. So this is sort of like cause and effect reasoning. If this, then that, or if this, therefore that.
You got a bunch of rules, and you can say, if these rules apply, therefore this is true, or therefore this will happen. And one of the key Sherlock Holmes is often cited as deductive reasoning, but actually I don't think he is
It's
deductive.
not really, no.
No.
That's the character archetype that he's
Mhm.
developed in like cultural zeitgeist. But
Yeah,
if you read the actual books, that's not
that's
how it
not how
works at
he
all. Like
works.
he makes like really crazy wild leaps from one thing to
Yeah.
another that don't actually make sense in principle if you
Yeah.
inspect them.
In actual fact, I think he applies inductive reasoning. And inductive reasoning
Yeah.
is when you go from a specific sort of observation, and then you make some you develop some patterns, and you come up with some rules based on those observations or those kind of thoughts. So
Yeah,
you kind of go
so
work backwards.
those two definitions sound very similar.
Yeah.
So what's the actual difference between the two is that deductive reasoning is outwards in, meaning like you're following a specific point. Like I said, if this, then that. Like it's like a sequential.
Mhm.
Inductive reasoning is inwards out, of like you have something that has happened and then you're looking at like what are the varying possibilities outlining from that. Like deductive is pruning the branches off of the tree. Inductive reasoning is growing the branches outwards on the tree, of like
Yeah,
what are the potential different paths that something can take.
yeah, kind of. And it's kind of like
It's not right. It's not a perfect
yeah,
uh, explanation.
yeah.
Inductive is more about pattern recognition and repetition, which is something that's really good for results analysis
So
in testing, like replicatability of things. Like
yeah,
an example, not specific to testing, but like if the sun has risen in the east every day, it will likely rise in the east tomorrow. Like you're seeing, like, oh, this has happened every day the same way every time. So it's likely that it will happen the same way again in the future. It's not necessarily guaranteed that that will always happen that way, but it probably will. Versus, you know, uh, a deductive reasoning version of that would be, I don't know. How would you use that same example in deductive?
so so in terms of like the way I think of it is so deductive is basically you have a bunch of patterns. So you have a bunch of patterns, like a bunch of experiments. Therefore, taking account of all of those patterns, you come up with some theory or some idea or some hypothesis. Um, Inductive is when you come hypothesis first. You have a hypothesis, and then you apply some patterns to that hypothesis. So you basically go from, like you're saying, the sun has risen in the east every day so far. Therefore, the sun always rises to the east. So you've taken a specific kind of observation, and then you've developed a pattern out of that. Whereas deductive is basically you've got a whole bunch of patterns, and then you derive an observation or a specific sort of idea based on that.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
Right.
and
You have an idea that you want to observe,
mhm,
is and you want to observe if that is true, is inductive reasoning.
yeah, yeah. So a lot of the time when you have, say for instance, from an experimentation perspective, um, inductive will sometimes be, well, I wonder if this is true, or I wonder if that is true, and then you apply you create a hypothesis uh, based on, like, if this works out to be true, then these patterns will apply, and then you kind of then you start building an experiment. Whereas a deductive approach would probably be, you've got a whole bunch of observations, a whole bunch of experiments, and then from there you derive some sort of hypothesis or some idea or some experiment. In reality, you're probably going to be mixing and matching a bit of both of those. So you're going to go from deductive to inductive to and then just kind of switch over. Like you probably go, based on these patterns, I think it's going to be this, and then as a result of you thinking this, you're going to be applying inductive reasoning, where you're applying a whole bunch of patterns that you haven't actually observed, etc. So if that makes sense.
There's two others
There's two others,
to
yes.
look at here: reductive and abductive. So
yes,
reductive is taking a problem and breaking it into smaller components or simpler elements to understand and solve it. So to sort of strain an analogy a little bit, reductive reasoning would be, say you run a multivariate test and you're unsure of the results. So you break the test, like you break it out and run each of the changes from the multivariate test as individual tests. You're like, you're isolating components of the problem to eliminate, like a common troubleshooting technique. Like say you're programming and you have an error, or and so what you would do is like eliminate half of the variables and see if the problem persists. If the problem persists, then like the variables that you eliminated were not the cause or unlikely to be the cause of the problem. And then you keep repeating that process. Like take the half that's causing the problem and keep halving it again until you're reducing it down to find which isolated piece is the issue.
And it doesn't have to be in exactly in that way. For instance, you can also do it in terms of, say, taking your example of an experiment, a multivariate experiment, and breaking it down. You can turn it into a stream of parallel experiments, collecting, isolating specific variables.
Mhm.
So then if you isolate the specific variables, you're then kind of still using that same principle to say, based on these outputs, you can still use a reductive reasoning in order to figure out where the win might be coming from, where a loss might be coming from. This is a very typical sort of approach if you're debugging. So we're both developers. So that process of debugging is very much a reductive sort of process. And sometimes I have to remind myself to stay in the reductive mindset when I'm debugging and not jump to inductive or deductive when I'm debugging some code.
Yeah, a practical example of this that I just experienced last week. One of my circuit breakers tripped down in my basement and it shut off all of my basement outlets, and I couldn't figure out what the problem immediately was. When it had happened in the past, I have a GFCI outlet that trips, and usually that's the problem. I go to fix it and I click the reset button and nothing's happening, and I'm like, oh, okay, this is a different issue. So then I'm like, I go over to the circuit breaker, I check all the breaker, they all appear to be working fine. I have two separate breaker boxes. I look in one breaker box, check all of those are fine, those aren't causing the problems. I look in the other breaker box, aha, there's the error breaker. I'm like reducing down
the
path until I find and isolate the cause of the problem.
Yeah, that's a good one. And then the inductive.
Yes, last and the fourth method of thought.
Yes.
And this is probably the one that people use the most unintentionally, and is probably the least reliable one in terms of data and experimentation, and that's just creating inferences that are the most likely explanation for an observation or phenomenon, often involving creative leaps. So,
Yes.
when we're talking like the Sherlock Holmes example of like, oh, Sherlock Holmes is a really logical person. Like is it if you read
He's
the
often
books,
using,
really he's using abductive reasoning of like,
yeah,
oh, there's this speck of dust on this gentleman's coat, therefore he must be the killer. And right, it's
yeah,
like, well, what was the journey to get there? Like,
yeah,
no, that's abductive reasoning. Or like making making assumptions about someone based on, say, a social media post that you read. Like, oh, I like, uh, oh, you mentioned that you voted for Brexit, therefore I know exactly what type of person you are. Like, no,
yeah,
that's abductive reasoning, where that's very fallible. Like, just because someone voted one way or another or mentioned something doesn't like logically map to a sequential series of events or
yeah.
thought processes.
And sometimes it can be useful. You can do abductive, like you can make certain leaps based on a specific observation and just make a really wild speculation um, about some event or something that you think is true, and then you can apply inductive reasoning to figure out like, okay, this thing that
Yeah.
I've observed, is there some specific patterns to do with that? Or maybe you can, just knowing that you've made a creative a leap, and just knowing that somebody has applied abductive reasoning kind of forces you into thinking, okay, so where are the gaps? How do I bridge this
Yeah.
leap?
Yeah.
What other of the reasoning techniques should I be using to then apply to this, so we don't you don't want to be making huge risky changes to your website uh, with by just doing abductive reasoning, for instance.
Yeah.
There's
Like,
certain places that you could do it, but you want to be applying some other you want to know when to apply some of these other reasoning rules.
yeah, the initial descriptor kind of painted it in a bad light.
Yeah,
And it's abductive reasoning is not an erroneous way of thinking about
yeah.
things, to be clear. Like,
None of these are good or bad.
no, there's no like bad or good to these. They're just different ways of thinking. Like, abductive reasoning is often a very valid starting point for thinking about things. And then once you start to peel the layers back, you switch to a different mode to be able to dig or prod deeper on a particular piece. Like,
Yeah.
an example of abductive reasoning is, you go and look, uh, out the window to see what the weather is going to be like, to make an assumption about the weather so that you can determine what kind of clothes you're going to wear for the day. If it looks like a nice sunny day outside, you're like, oh, I can wear light clothes. But you actually open the door and feel, and like, oh, it's cold outside. Like, that didn't quite work. There were different modes you were applying there, of like
Mm,
making a quick generalized observation, because the consequence of the solution isn't at, adversely impactful. Like the level of impact that the result may have could potentially affect the line of reasoning or thinking that you're applying to it. How important or critical is that decision to make?
mm. And sometimes abductive can be, I mean, you're taking creative leaps, so it's good
Mhm.
to make these creative leaps when you're doing something creative. And so in
Like
that kind of
thinking
sense,
outside the box.
thinking outside the box, it's kind of like, this is when you should be applying, or this is when applying abductive reasoning is really good. But then after you think outside the box, it's always like I was saying before, you have to think about where you're going to apply it to, and whether or not you want to stay with abductive reasoning in order to figure out the application. Like, yeah, I want to make this change on my website. I'm going to think outside the box. Now, after you think outside the box, before you invest all that effort into developing this thing, this experiment or whatever, you should just know that this came out of abductive reasoning. You probably want to be looking for other patterns. You want to be looking to use some of these other reasoning methods to basically bridge that gap and make it less risky and give you a process forward to try and implement something or figure out what to implement.
Yeah, we've talked about it before, but like looking at like iterative versus transformative
Yep.
scale, like abductive reasoning would apply more towards things on the potentially apply more towards things on the transformative side, where it's like, here's a big, wild, crazy idea that's less uh, uh, reliable or a less proven methodology, right? There's no pattern, there's no priors to observe before that, but it's an interesting thing that could have a huge potential benefit. So let's try it out.
Yep. Yeah.
Right. So anything else to think about there?
There's a lot to think about there. Like this is
very much only scratching the surface. Like you said, there's a whole book written about this. Like,
I mean, it's not
theory. So
purely written about this, but
well,
this
yeah,
is
but
this is this is the part of the book that I most scratched my head on when I was going through it. When creating characters and stuff, like you say in Dramatica, you have characters that can only reason in certain ways, like they're abductive reasoning. Therefore, you have to make sure that they're consistent across the story about how they reason, how they kind of solve problems and stuff like that. But yeah, like you were saying at the beginning as well, those storytelling techniques and stuff, it really very universal, because you can apply it in so many different ways. And just as soon as you apply a label to something, it's really useful in order to identify, like, okay, I am thinking in this way, or this isn't working. How can I apply? This isn't working. It's not working because I'm only applying abductive reasoning to solve this problem. Maybe I should try applying some of these other techniques or other reasoning methods in order to resolve this problem.
Within a storytelling like if you're an author trying to tell a story,
Mhm.
you're restricted because you're trying to create characterization and keep your characters consistent and things like that.
Yes.
But within reality, an individual human can switch between, like a real person can easily switch between these modes. Like, you're not locked into, oh, I'm only a such and such thinker. Like, like, oh, like, Iqbal, you're such an inductive person. Like, you're always thinking, like, no, that's not
It could, like,
correct.
there could be a dominance.
You may have bias, right? It's like a
there may
spectrum
be a
of scale,
dominant
but
thing.
yeah, but don't get too caught up in, like, it's not like a psychological profile scale, like it's not like Myers-Briggs or any of those other, silly things like that have sometimes some basis in truth, but a lot of times don't actually.
But
And
it has been quite useful in terms of identifying, like, different ways of approaching, like I say, an experimentation program or experimentation framework, or kind of like dealing with people who have come up with a Hippo coming up with an idea versus this coming up with an idea. It's once you know those reasoning techniques and what reasoning sort of models and stuff, it's quite interesting to see it actually happen with people coming up with ideas and in discussions and stuff like that with team members. So yeah, like I say, that I have
the essence of storytelling is communicating an idea from one person to another.
Yes.
And with experimentation, you're trying to either make a decision or convince someone that this is the decision to make. And so how are you telling the story of the work that you did to get that result.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Excellent. As always, if you ever have any questions, feedback, or disagree with something that we said here, you can talk to me and Iqbal face to face at the CRO Roundtable every Friday and you can find links to the roundtable either at crotalks.com or our CRO Talks LinkedIn page. We've started to put up recurring LinkedIn events for the roundtable to make it easier to find. If you're shy or you don't like speaking, you can always connect with us on social media instead. Thank you for listening, and we will catch you next time.